Do we have sound? Great. Through which he has innovated in curriculum and culture, vision and values of what's possible in publicly funded education. Seth is also a senior advisor at the White House and will be speaking today in his own voice, which he'll explain. Seth and I were on a panel, a think tank, about 6 months ago on citizenship. Both of us graciously accepted out of favors to friends. And we all know that when we do that, great things happen. And it was my delight to get to know Seth as a thinker. He is an innovator, an independent thinker. He sees through to what is valuable and real and helpful for students. And it's a great honor to welcome Seth Andrew to Teachers College.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I am so excited to be here and absolutely terrified. And here's the primary reason I'm terrified. Number one, I have never given this talk before. So you are about to see like the dress rehearsal, the dry run, the practice all at once. I have two phenomenal stump speeches. I'm giving one later with the technology team at TC. If you want to see the stump speech, it's ready to go. I didn't need to work on I tweaked 2 slides. We were good to go. But this is new, and this is different from my public role. And so, in fact, when a member of the administration asks to give a talk in their personal capacity, you actually have to sign a whole lot of paperwork. But for me, that was great because it meant I got to put on my baseball cap. Spent 2 years now working for the Obama administration, but today I'm here totally in my personal capacity as a friend of Lisa, as somebody very passionate about this work that you are all committed to and that you are all doing, and interested in having a conversation with you. So I hope that this is not a straight speech. I hope we have some time for Q&A and for interaction, for some conflict, for some dialogue, because this is something I'm fascinated by and passionate about, and I hope to learn as much from our conversation today as you do. I will start by saying, because I'm here in my personal capacity, that gives me an opportunity to provoke, challenge, and probably offend you. I think I said possibly there, but it's more like probably. And the second thing I would say as sort of a preface is that don't doubt the data. So I'm going to throw a fire hose of data at you, mostly about America's standing in the world in terms of education. And there's a lot of debate that happens around standardized tests and assessments and other things, and all I just ask you to do is suspend disbelief and just trust that the data represents something important, even if it's not your favorite choice of data. If you disagree with me, come up with a better hypothesis, and in Q&A, let's talk about it. So as you start to see my hypothesis unfold, let's talk about it together. And I really want to push your thinking and challenge you. So Lisa said that you guys are the troops who want to be motivated to go out and make these changes yourselves in your schools, in your classrooms, in your work. And I'm excited to help you do that. But I also want to push you. We get in ruts in education. We do the same thing because it's what we've done, because it's what we're comfortable with. It's because it's how we taught. It's because it's how we learned. It's because it's what the schools that we went to. And that is a problem. And as I will talk about in a second, it's a deep problem, especially for our lowest income and most disadvantaged kids in America. So we have to think differently and change our approach. And the last thing I'll say is I was born and raised very close to here. I talk really fast, so buckle up. I have a lot of content here in a very little period of time. But I'm happy to make sure to sort of dig in a little bit more, share citations, and go into depth in the pieces that make the most sense. So with that, let's go. So here's the do now. What percentage of low-income Americans earn a bachelor's degree by age 24? Who wants to throw out a number? 10. Anybody else?
20.
20. Anybody else? 8. All right, so it's between 8 and 10. What are the primary barriers to low-income student success in America? What do you think they are? What are some of those barriers? Money. What else?
K-12 education.
The K-12 education system. What else? Knowledge on how to do it. Great. Others? Well, that was like everybody. Somewhere over here. Social capital. Somebody over here.
Poverty.
I'm sorry? Poverty. Somebody over here. Opportunity. Somebody over there. Parent engagement and?
I said that.
Great. So you were on the same page. So we're going to go through, I think, almost all of those hypotheses to some of the barriers, and I will tell you my hypothesis to what is the real barrier and what is not. And then what would be your 2 primary solutions to these barriers as educators? So Lisa's told me a little bit about your backgrounds as a collective, but so you come from different positions in the education world. How would you solve these problems? Give me a word or two. How would you solve some of these problems? Training. Mentorship. Financial aid.
Addressing poverty as a society.
Addressing poverty as a society. Early education, I love it. Others? Parent engagement, so the inverse, right? Wonderful. So we're going to tackle almost all of these things, and the theme that I heard running through a lot of your commentary was money, so I'm glad that I've got a couple slides on that. So here's what we're going to try to do today. We're going to try to cover all of this. It's a lot. We're going to try to quantify the global scale of this crisis. We're going to try to articulate why school culture and purpose drive failure or success, not poverty. We're going to identify some internationally and locally successful strategies for cultivating purpose. We're going to define and expand democracy, and we're going to determine your role as an educator walking out of here to foster your purpose and to get to work. So we in America don't represent the country in this room. This is an affluent, college-educated white room. That's not what America is. We have a crisis in America of unbelievable proportions. Unfathomable proportions to most of us in this country. Things that we can't even wrap our head around to understand that when we talk about reform, I have now come to this point in my career, now 15 years in the education space, to reject the word reform because it's not enough. Reform implies tinkering, and reform implies change, and implies doing a little bit of this, or a little bit of that, or a little bit more money, or a little bit, and it's not actually what we need. We need revolution. And revolution is a little scary. It's why I have to talk in my personal capacity when you work for the government, okay? But it's actually what we need in education. And it's what we need in education because the kids that we are talking about, the kids that Democracy Prep serves, the kids that I hope some of you serve in different capacities, are facing this in a daily way that we cannot fathom. So let me try to help you fathom it for a second. What would happen if we had a 91% failure rate for a population of the water system? If 91% of the time for a population in America, you turned on the tap and it didn't run. If 91% of the time you turned the switch on the wall and that public distribution system that gets to your house didn't turn on the lights. If 91% of the time your highway didn't get where it was going because of a pothole or like a bridge that fell down. If the prisons let out 91% of the prisoners by accident, whatever you think about criminal justice reform, right? If it wasn't intentional, there would be a revolution. We would not stand for this. We would not tolerate it. The population that suffers this unbelievable coercion in a system that is broken would fight. And for some reason in America, we haven't seen a revolution in education. And so part of what I hope to do today is to help you think about this from a fundamental shift of moving college from a fundamental privilege for the few to the right that everyone deserves. That paradigm shift shouldn't be about beating the odds. We have to think about our language. It needs to be about changing the odds. And it can't be just for some kids. It can't be the scholarship recipient or the one or the two kids who get lucky enough to get into your school or go through your admissions process. It needs to be for everyone that this is part of who we are as America, is a country that provides opportunity to everyone, because today we do not. If you are born to a poor womb, you are basically destined to have multi-generational poverty. There are exceptions, as in all of the statistics and all the data we're going to show. There's outliers in every level. But at the end of the day, at the core of that data, if you are poor in America, 91% of you will never see a college degree or the inside of this room. And that is unacceptable, and that is un-American, and it is our job today to go out and fight that. And for me, it means that we have to bring in this sense that is the theme of our convening around spirituality and purpose. Because that, to me, is the purpose that brings me into this work, that brings me to do this every day. I'll tell you just a bit about myself for a second, because it's in the theme of the day. I grew up in Upper Manhattan on 183rd Street and 103rd. I went to New York City Public Schools, K-12, to a Jewish mother and a Quaker father. I have married a Catholic wife with a Buddhist mother, and we are trying to figure out how to raise our twin girls, and we have not figured that out yet. So my humanism is probably at the center of my own thinking, but I will tell you that what animates me more, both religiously and spiritually, is this work, is the work of educating and transforming education in America, and the fundamental value of our democracy, and the way that that fits into our education. Because this is something that is possible. This upside-down America, this paradigm shift is possible. And I'm going to give you a lesson you didn't expect when coming to the spirituality conference today, to help prove that. And I asked Lisa how much she wanted me to go into this, so I've actually cut it way back. But it is still what you did not expect, is to get a lesson in Korean history. This is the international performance on PISA. PISA is one of the best tests of international assessments. They have tests in reading, the math, science. They now have tests in critical thinking, and it studies the OECD countries. So this is only the developed world. We're not even talking about the developing world. What you'll see here is that the United States is not only below the median, but is dropping fast. We used to be at the top of this chart in most of the OECD data. So the OECD head is coming to the White House tomorrow to talk with us about this data. And what this data shows, I know it might be a little bit tough, but real quickly. So I'm only getting it here. Okay, got it. So Korea is up here. And what this upper green quadrant represents is both high performance and equally socially equitable distribution of learning opportunities. So if you are poor in Korea or you have relatively similar educational opportunities based on all the OECD data. The United States, if you haven't found it yet, is right here in the middle, meaning that we are middling in terms of performance, actually lower than average in terms of performance, as I said, and average in terms of social equity because we basically perpetuate and sustain the system that the kids walk in the door with. So now what you're thinking is you're saying, well, of course that's true because we spend too much money on our wealthy schools and not enough money on our poor schools. Well, that's actually not totally true. What has happened across the course of American spending is that we now spend more dollars per capita than almost any country in the world. The big picture is we spend about $12,000 per pupil in America. We spend more than Korea, we spend more than Japan, we spend more than those other dots. These now, the size of the dot represents spending. I don't think that's actually up there anymore. No, it didn't come up. So the size of the dots now represents spending per capita based on GDP. So I'll show you a little bit more data on this in a second, but we're spending more money, and then you're thinking, well, it must not be the total dollars, it must be how we're allocating it. Well, New York, New Jersey spends $22,000 per pupil. We operate schools in Camden, New Jersey, where we spend $23,000 per pupil. We operate schools here in New York, the highest spending district in America, certainly the highest spending big district in America, spending about $21,000 per pupil. So we're spending a whole lot of money, and let me just put that into context for 1 second so that the people who started off the conversation, and now I'm going to be provoking and pushing and challenging you, talking about money or opportunity or poverty, $20,000 a kid is what we're spending in New York City, Camden, Newark. Let's half that. Say we're going to spend $10,000 per kid. Okay, so I'm going to cut the budget of New York City, Newark, and Camden by half. Doesn't sound like a good policy proposal, but just listen. That means that every classroom in Camden, New Jersey has $250,000 to spend to educate 25 kids, the average class size in America. So we have $250,000 in public money, in our tax dollars, to spend per classroom to educate a group of children. Your salary in America is still $55,000 a year. So that means that $200,000 is going to something other than the teacher, on average in America. And remember, I cut it in half. So we're not spending the money on the teacher, and we have $200,000 per classroom left over. And by the way, this is all operating dollars. I'm not talking about capital and building buildings, just operating. Where does the money go in our public systems? Where does it actually go? And I have now been studying this and thinking about this and working at the federal government, in the White House and the US Department of Education, and I cannot tell you the answer in most places. And the answer is very complex and more time than we have now to go into, but the big picture is it is not about quantity. It is about how we spend the money. And one of the things that people then say is, well, in some states we're doing better, right? In some states we're doing okay. For example, Massachusetts. Massachusetts is usually thought of as the highest performing state in America. Well, the highest performing state in America is still being outperformed by Korea. So the entire state of Massachusetts, the best ed reform system, the highest standards, they've had MCAS for years. I don't know if anybody's from Massachusetts. Like they went through this reform thing 10 years before the rest of the country did, or moving to higher standards, and accountability and assessments and all these things. They got great results based on American standards, and the kids in Korea are still kicking their butts. Let me give you a quick sense of how badly they're getting their butts kicked. This is the United States on PISA math performance by decile of social background. What that means is that at the bottom, the bottom decile, the kids in South Korea who are the poor kids are beating the rich kids in the United States. The poor kids in Korea are beating the rich kids in the United States. So we were thinking about poverty before as the challenge. But now, just real quickly, what are you thinking is some of the challenge that we didn't come in the first round of one words? What are some of the other challenges that might explain what we're seeing so far?
We have
More poor kids, no, this is percentage and ratio based. So it's controlled for size of population. It's not numbers, it's averages. One more time, sorry? Quality of education. Student motivation. Expectations. Others? Culture, thank you. All right, good. We're there. All of those things, but culture is the word I was looking for, fishing for. So here's what we're talking about. Those low-performing kids those low-income kids in South Korea are beating the wealthiest kids, the kids you serve, in Scarsdale and in private schools, in the wealthiest communities in America. So what is going on? Well, we have to figure out how we're going to fix this, because I think everybody at this stage should recognize we have a serious problem as a country if we're going to see data like this and just say, oh, no big deal. I don't think anybody's thinking no big deal right now. You wouldn't have come. So what are the mandatory tools at our disposal? What are the voluntary disposal? And what are the unique tools at your disposal as an individual in your role? And that's one of the questions I want to start you thinking about right now. And so as you're jotting down notes and sort of running through some of the things that we're talking about today, just think about what are the tools at your disposal. Well, let me talk about my current position in government. What does government require? You are required to pay your taxes, right? You will go to jail if you don't pay your taxes over time. You will get fines, it will be bad, you have to pay your taxes. That is required by government. The selective service and the draft in times of war are required by government. Selective service for men and draft for theoretically everybody, although we haven't had one for a while, are required by government. You could argue that insurance, whether auto insurance at the state level or now nationally, healthcare insurance, although there is an opt-out and a fine mechanism, which basically says you can pay to get out of it if you don't really want to buy insurance. Jury duty is required by government. You have to do this. Constitution says so. And school. We require kids to go to school. Now, you can opt out to go to a private school, you can get homeschooled, but you have to go to school. You have to demonstrate to the government that you're educating your child, usually through 16, sometimes through 18 now. But as far as the tools in our disposal, certainly as government, school is the most profound and most powerful tool we have. And instead of using it for the disruption, for the revolution, for the changes that we need to see in our schools, consistently what government has continued to do is replicate the systems of the past, maintaining the exact system we have. How do you determine what school a kid goes to? By where they live, by their zip code. That is what happens in America. Now, if you're academically gifted, you may be able to apply to a test entry school. I went to Bronx Science. It was actually kind of a crappy school, but it had a lot of smart kids in it because we all had to take a test to get in. That didn't indicate the quality of the program or the quality of the teachers necessarily, but it did indicate the quality of the students on their tests coming in 8th grade to go to this school. So now, other than the students at the top 5% of the bell curve in terms of aptitude on standardized tests at the point at which they're tested, we are stuck with a system that says if you live on 125th Street and Douglas houses, or in Grant houses, you go to school at PS 123, because that's where you live. And so we have perpetuated over and over, generation after generation. It is the most effective tool I can imagine creating. If I wanted to create a system that perpetuated this system, I would say, great, well, we'll decide where you go to school based on where you live. Because that would lock in all of the inequities, all the historic inequities, all the racial inequities, all the incredible injustices of our past and of our current systems, and I would lock them in. So now at this point, you're probably starting to say, wait, where's spirituality? You got to wait a little longer. So I'm going to give you what we tried to do for the past 40 years. We tried to use reform in what I call a 1.0 hypothesis. This is what America did. We tried to solve poverty and segregation. We bussed kids around, we tried magnet schools, we did all sorts of different things around poverty and segregation. Then we said we need better credentials for teachers. Then we said we need smaller class sizes. Then we said we need more funding. And then we said, well, we just can't change culture. That's not what government does. That's not what we do. Well, government requires our kids to go to school. School is most of the waking time that a kid spends more than any other single place. And so I would argue that it actually can be used as a tool to change culture. And for me, this paradigm shift happened by accident in South Korea. My girlfriend, coming out of high school and in college, was on a Fulbright in South Korea. She had me come out for 2 weeks to South Korea, and so I taught in South Korea because she convinced me to stay, and I was like, all right, I get to live with my girlfriend now in South Korea. This is awesome. The food's great, and I was really welcome. And I was like, but what do I do for a job? And she's like, we can teach English. And I'm like, I don't have a credential. I don't have a certification. I don't have anything. What do you mean I can teach? She's like, just print out a resume. We're going to go to schools. You're going to get a job. So she was right. I was wrong. That's the beginning of a long trend in our nearly 20 years together. And she has said, that this was the best thing that ever happened to me professionally, and I didn't even do it intentionally. It was a total accident. Because then I got to start to understand Korean education and history, and only the stuff that I'm showing you now, OECD in 2012, that wasn't the case back in 2000, 2001. It was in the trend line, but it wasn't there yet. So the first myth about South Korean history is that poverty prevents success. Well, this is downtown Seoul and suburban Seoul. In 1950, Korea was the poorest country in Asia, poorer than almost all of sub-Saharan Africa. GDP per capita was about $50 coming out of the Korean War. Korea has no natural resources. Korea does not have gold or diamonds or oil. Korea had a history of colonization and slavery that was incredibly profound and mind-blowing when you get into the history. And so this was downtown Seoul. The second thing that I started to understand was that segregation prevents success is what I kept hearing in America. But here I was in Korea teaching very poor kids by American standards. And they were homogenous and stratified totally by class. So they were totally segregated by class. But they were some of the hardest working, most effective kids that I'd ever met. And they were all poor. So I guess I'm sitting there being like, I went to Brown, I went to Bronx Science, I thought I was smart, and everything I learned seems to be dead wrong. And then I was told at Brown and other places, you needed better credentials. Well, Korean hires foreign talent like me, focuses on educator performance and not credentials. And then I walked into my class and they were like, okay, here's your class, it's 45 kids a day, times 6 periods a day. Do I have a lesson plan? Nope. Do I have what do I do? Well, they were like, well, we trust you. We gave you an assessment to decide whether you're going to be a great teacher. We think you speak English well, like you're going to teach English. And I was like, okay, here I go. I'm shortly out of college. I'm trying to figure this all out. Well, here I am with this 45-kid classes 6 times a day trying to figure it out. Well, in fact, Korea had some of the largest class sizes in the world. In fact, they've gone down a little bit, and they're still some of the largest class sizes in the world from 2000 to 2010. And then the last thesis was that we must spend more money. Korean classrooms in 2001 weren't well-resourced. They had old wooden desks. They had chalk and a heater. There was no technology. When we think about Korea today, we think of Samsung and LG and all the things we think about today. That was not what schools looked like in 2000, 2001. They were old, and they spent about a third per pupil of what we did. So as a percentage of GDP, and that's total dollars, but a percentage of GDP, we were spending dramatically more, and we continue to spend more. Korea was spending some of the lowest per capita GDP in the world. You're still saying, wait, spirituality, wait, where is it? It's coming. So one of the things that I think will resonate in this room that is fascinating about Korea is a system that meant that poor kids can go to private schools. Poor kids in Korea, these 4 bots are all on the same point. That means that the bottom quartile of income and the top quartile of income all go to private schools at almost 40%. In the USA, the top quartile, about 25% of wealthy kids go to private schools, but basically no poor kids go to private schools. Right? You all have scholarships, and there are scholarships in private schools, but that's like 5%, 2% of the population. But in Korea, the equitable distribution of high-quality educational resources was not stratified by where you lived, nor was it stratified by how much money your family had. So we spent, as America, the last 40 years being dead wrong. We started spending more money on teacher certifications and master's degrees. We started spending more money absolutely in terms of per pupil spending on average. We reduced our teacher-to-student ratios from the 1960s, and our NAEP scores, our PISA scores, our TIMSS scores, our English math scores, it doesn't matter what it is, basically stayed flat. So how did this happen? That while the United States was already one of the wealthiest countries in the world in 1951, and continued to, this is health and wealth. So this is per capita income in dollars and life expectancy. So this is health and wealth. Are you getting healthier and wealthier? And the answer for Korea was faster than any place else in the world. They went from poverty that was equal to Uganda, Afghanistan, India in 1951 to now the Korea that we think about today. They are universally educated. Basically, everyone has a high school diploma. We're at about 80% in America. They have the highest percentage of post-secondary education in the world. The United States we used to hold that title just 20 years ago. We're now falling and falling and falling. So how in the world did they do that? Well, culture and purpose. So we're close. My distillation of their culture and their purpose in Korea was to say that basically they had grit, they had a growth mindset, and they valued and honored and respected great teachers. This is not rocket science. This is not impossible. It's not impossible to go from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest countries in the world, to go from one of the most sort of agrarian and old industrial countries in the world to one of the most technologically advanced democracies with a female president in the world. Like, it is not impossible to do that in our lifetimes. Some people in this room were alive at the point where Korea was as poor as it was coming out of war. And they did it through, I believe, these three things. And what that was to me was a purpose. So now we're going to get to the question of spirituality, because for me, spirituality is really about purpose. And I told you at the beginning my purpose in this work. And I think that what we have to do as educators is instill that purpose in our kids, is give them the same purpose that we come to school every day with. That we need to transmit that purpose to them so that they can take it and run with it and use it for the rest of their lives. And what Korea got right and we got wrong was we were missing with the wrong variables. The right variables were around purpose and spirituality and culture. And when they got that right, they saw tremendous impacts. And so just one other quick analogy. In 1952, Korea was split into two by an arbitrary line drawn halfway across the peninsula. So these are people that had the same history, same language, same culture. And above the line, they had no democracy, no market economy, no opportunity, no high-quality education. Below the line, they had all those things. And now we see North and South Korea, 60 years later. One of the poorest countries in the world, one of the richest countries in the world. So I can tell you as a researcher, as a scientist, I don't know how many academics there are in the world, that there's probably no better random control trial than drawing an arbitrary line in the middle of a country and saying everybody above it is one thing, everybody below it is another thing, and we've seen the results. So we have a lot to learn. And so what I did when I came back was I started a school, and we use the title No Excuses. Sometimes this gets a bad rap now, I defend it, because it's not no excuses for the kids, it's no excuses for the adults. The distinction of no excuses for the adults means simply that when we walk into the building as adults in that building, we have no excuses. Our kids come with poverty. Our kids come with trauma. Our kids come with toxic stress that I can't even fathom because I didn't live it. But it's our job with no excuses to say, we're still getting you to college. We're still getting you to citizenship. We're still going to make this possible. And so despite using these wrong hypotheses, when you have purpose at a school like we do at Democracy Prep, at the best schools that I've been to, those hypotheses with purpose get you to the results that I think all of us want to see. So instead of focusing on reducing poverty, which a school has very little capacity to control, remember I asked you to jot down what tools are at your disposal? You don't have the power to make your families rich. Not in the moment. You do multi-generationally by giving them an education. So your tools are about what you can do. So instead we said we want to raise the rigor, expectations, somebody said earlier. We said instead of credentials, we're going to focus on talent. So a huge percent of our teachers were uncertified. Well, I sort of looked at the private school world at the beginning and was like, most of the private school world seems to be uncertified by typical standards. Like, why shouldn't we be able to do that for low-income kids? We should hire great people and let them make good decisions. We use thoughtful data, we spend more time, and that culture is malleable. And this, to me, is one of the most important things. So our schools at Democracy Prep and other high-quality, no-excuses schools take these 5 elements: inspiring talent, more time, increased rigor, thoughtful data, joyous culture, to prove that it's possible. To prove that it's possible to hold every kid to this high expectation of this greater purpose about what their life is for and why we're doing this together. So at Democracy Prep, I also wanted to challenge a couple of other critiques that I think all of you have probably had or at least heard about the public charter school sector. One is that it's run by hedge funds and it's run by the privatization forces. I find that interesting because it's usually the people that are the most sort of sending their kids to private schools and of a wealthy background that are making those critiques. It's not the poor kids that go to our schools or wait on our wait lists. But the big picture is we decided to say, you know what, we're not taking philanthropy. We're going to be 100% publicly funded. We're going to take no extra dollars. We're going to show that this is possible for every school. We said, the critique is, and this is big in the news in New York right now, that you're going to push out kids. Well, we said, I'm a special education teacher. I had a learning disability. I had an IEP in New York City public schools. And I was passionate about serving kids with special needs. So we got 30% of our kids with IEPs. We have about 15% across the network of our kids in ELL. Depends on which community we're in, which school now, of 20 different schools. And we take kids at all grades, which means when a kid leaves our school for any reason, and they will leave all schools for other reasons, we fill that seat with somebody from the wait list at every grade level, all the way to 12. And then the last is that we wanted to make sure this focus on civics. So the 6th and final myth about Korea is that the idea is somehow that culture is immutable. And the amazing thing about this answer that I'm trying to present to you, the hypothesis I'm presenting to you today, is that culture is the best news we could hope for in the war against poverty, in the war against illiteracy, in the war against quality education that stinks for poor kids, because culture is created by us. And educators get sometimes 8 hours a day to build culture and give purpose and point in the direction that we want our kids to achieve and then help them get there. And so we have culture in our hands. Korea did this by being conscious and purposeful and deliberate about their culture, about saying education was the highest value, about saying they respect teachers. And so if culture is 100% human created, that is great news. You can go from an agrarian economy to the Psy economy, where now instead of not just technology, they're focused on exporting culture because they realize eventually they're going to get beat in technology, so they have to make the world want their culture. right? And so they basically have been ahead of the curve at each major transition in the economy over the past 60 years because they have the best educated workforce in the world. So who's making the decisions? Who's voting for the population? Who's leading the country? Well, people that are well educated, and so they're making good decisions. In our country, when you have uneducated people engaged in the process, when you have 50% of Americans choosing not to turn out to vote, we have the lowest voter turnout in 70 years, we don't have the people who need to have the greatest say, the people that need the revolution the most, in our civic process. So we have so much to do. And so my favorite argument, though, about culture is that I think that culture is best when it is a hybrid culture. And I give to you my best argument about a hybrid culture. It is a kimchi taco. And if you have not had a kimchi taco, I implore you to get a kimchi taco because it is the most delicious thing you can possibly eat. It is better than the Korean food. It is better than the Mexican food. It is just a whole different world that is better than either part. And it is the best of the East and the West together, that when you put those things together, you're going to get a result that is better than just doing one or the other. So I am not advocating for a Korean model of education. That is disastrous for a million reasons. I am advocating for a hybrid culture that takes the best from what we've learned from them, that takes the best of our diversity in America and puts it together in a way that is stronger than any one part. And so if we take those lessons from Korea and beyond, then we start to see the data. All right. So now I've given you a little bit about purpose and why I came to this point in my life. But now I am of the belief that without data, then there is only opinion. So I presented pretty much up to you now opinion. I presented my hypothesis, I presented what I thought, and so we've spent the last 4 years studying this. We studied it with about 5 different researchers in random control trials. The way we do a random control trial is the same as you would with a drug. It's an actual blind, double-blind RCT. We say to families, you want to come to this school? They say, yes. Then you say, great, you can come, you can't. Nothing, no other factor, right? Anywhere in New York City. And then we study the kids who come, and we study the kids who don't. And we study the kids who didn't apply. And we try to figure out what the differences are between those 3 big groups. The control, the treatment, and then the did not seek treatment. Everybody with me? These are the short answers. Roland Fryer is a MacArthur Genius Grant winner at Harvard. He did our first RCT. He studied the racial achievement gap for most of his career. Basically, he is petrified, as am I, that the racial achievement gap is the big black bar, and all of the things we've tried in the social sciences have been those small bars. So whether that's Teach for America, if you like that, or if you like early childhood education, there's Head Start, any of these programs, you can add them up together and basically not get to solve the racial achievement gap. So the good news is that academic performance does basically reduce the racial achievement gap dramatically, and socioeconomic even more so. So much so that in the college level, if you equalize 8th grade test scores across black kids and white kids, if you equalize their test scores, that makes the black kid 137% more likely to go to college in America today if you equalize their 8th grade test scores. That's a lot of work, but that means that now that kid is on a path where they can come to a room like this. And so some of you are saying, yeah, but I don't care about test scores. That's fine. The data then shows that teen pregnancy, out of wedlock births, health outcomes, crime outcomes, basically everything is not just correlated, it's directly correlated. And because it's an RCT, we're about as close to causal as we can demonstrate between those impacts that we're having. And so when we started to study what used to happen is we would focus on class size, per pupil expenditures, tertiary certification, master's degree. And what Roland found basically was that they had a negative effect. So you see the negative signs in the beginning and the star meaning that it's statistically significant. That's not good. We were spending a lot of money on things that not only didn't have a positive effect, they had a negative effect. And remember, those are the opposite things that Koreans are doing. Koreans, larger class sizes, less per pupil expenditures, fewer teachers with certification, fewer teachers with master's degrees per se, because they had a better undergraduate teacher education system. So at Democracy Prep, we basically had a number of RCTs and similar folks. These were our initial data. We've had 2 subsequent RCTs that actually increased these a little bit. But basically, that's math and English scores. These are standard deviations. So we're talking about 0.3 standard deviation per year. Back to that racial achievement graph, we're talking about 1 standard deviation total, which means that if we're doing 0.3 standard deviations a year, we're going to be able to close that gap in about 3 years. If we continue on that path, we can reverse that gap. And so this is what we studied next, is like what was happening, what was beneath the veil. Well, the answer is teacher feedback, data-driven instruction, tutoring, instructional time, high expectations. My favorite is high expectations because it doesn't cost anything. This is the way that it shows graphically in Roland's reports. If we do these things, we get negative results. If we do these things, we get pretty positive results. These are an additional months of schooling, right? So we basically get a full month of extra schooling from tutoring. But holding high expectations, we get almost a full month, like 3 weeks of extra schooling statistically. based on holding higher expectations. My short anecdote about this is that when I was running Democracy Prep, I would go around the high school and I'd say, how are you doing in your classes? My kids would say, I'm doing great, I'm passing all my classes, Mr. Andrew. And I'd say, I don't care about your passing. That's not the goal. Be like, what do you mean? I mean, I'm passing all my classes. This is great. I'm going to the next grade. You know, like that was the bar we set. And so they had to pass with a 70. And so in the middle of the school year, we have 3 trimesters, between trimester 1 and trimester 2. So therefore, we did not change the curriculum. We did not change the kids, and we did not change the teachers. We raised our passing grade to 83. You can imagine the kids did not love this decision. But I was sick of hearing them saying, I'm passing my grades. You know, I have a GPA of 73. And they were proud of this. And it was our fault. That's what we set the bar at. So we now said 83 is the new 70, like orange is the new black, and you got to get 83. Sorry, kids. And you know what happened in the next trimester? Their GPA went up. We didn't change the kids, we didn't change the teacher, we didn't change the curriculum. Their GPA went up. Why? Because we had no dollars added, we just raised the bar. And our kids said, wow, that's the purpose? I'm not going to shoot for the purpose that's here, I'm going to shoot for the purpose that's here. I'm going to shoot for something bigger than myself. And so the last thing I'll say on this data point is that Roland also tried to study how much additional spending we had per pupil, because that was one of the themes at our first little roundtable, right? And so some of the other schools that have had a massive impact are spending more dollars per pupil. Democracy Prep is spending $3,500 less per student than New York City public schools are. So he got mad at me because that meant that it was actually, in his regression analysis, a null answer because it was infinite. Meaning the way that he was looking at it was that the less we spent, the better our results got. Which meant statistically, if we spent 0, we'd have maximal results. That is not true, that is not what I'm arguing, but that is why he was so inspired to sort of write about this and continue the research on it. We now, on the New York State assessments, about 70% of our kids are showing aspirational performance in college, because the goal is not high school graduation or that 8th grade test score, the goal is life success, and we'll talk about this in just one more second. And actually the real data, so this was the projected data by the New York State, right now about 93% of our graduates over the last 4 years are still persisting in their higher education program, in their 4-year program. So we're on track, and I can't claim success yet until all those kids actually get the 4-year degree that we promised them, but that we are on track to get over 90% of them, and so literally to invert that country that I showed you at the beginning for low-income kids. So the lessons I want you to take away are that if you set the purpose, if you set the culture, that hard work equals success, that respect for teachers overall is going to help to lift the profession and lift our students, that education is the highest value, and if we combine the best of East and West, we combine different cultures and different diverse backgrounds, that is what's going to get us the results that we're looking for. And so we need to figure out how to create this purpose in all of our schools, especially those serving low-income kids. There are a couple ways that research has shown you can create purpose. You can have an external threat. So actually, Korea had a head start. They had an advantage. They were actually still technically at war. So the people had to come together to say there's something literally across the border, like 15 miles away over the DMZ, that we are worried is going to come down and try to take everything that we're building. And so we have to keep working harder. And so that external threat is real. So we have to figure out how to create the perception of an external threat in our kids. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't need to be war, right? It can be poverty. That's an external threat for our kids. It can be illiteracy. That's an external threat for our kids, that they can see coming at them, seeing multi-generational poverty themselves, and saying, I don't want that. That's a threat I'm going to fight against. Democracy creates purpose, civic engagement creates purpose, public service mandate with choice creates a purpose, stable family structures create purpose. And so there's a fair amount of data for that. So when I say number 2 is democracy, well, what do I mean? And this is where I think spirituality for me is tied in with a word that it's not for most. For me, democracy was the thing that I thought at the root of all this work was why we were fighting for great schools. And so our definition of democracy evolved, because when I was in the first year of Democracy Prep, this is 2005, one of my students came up and said, Mr. Andrew, what's democracy? He was a 6th grader. And I was like, well, let me tell you about Thomas Jefferson, 3 branches of government and checks and balances. And I was like, oh, this is terrible. Like, I'm trying to explain to a 10-year-old democracy, and I'm doing a very bad job, and I run a school called Democracy Prep. This is not a recipe for long-term success, and so I basically had to say, our definition of democracy, we need to figure out a better one. Our teachers went back and we spent a week thinking about our purpose, and we'd all agreed to this purpose of democracy, but we hadn't defined it particularly well. So the taxonomy, the language we use is really important, and one of my best teachers, Ms. Birdsell, came back and said, we've got it. It took us a week, but we've got it. Democracy is choice and voice. If you have those 2 things, you have democracy. If you are absent either one, you do not. You must have choice and voice. And so our purpose as a school to advance democracy and our mission and our students and scholarship and citizenship was these two things to advance democracy, scholarship and citizenship. And so for me, citizenship became the spiritual purpose because we were advancing democracy, and we had to provide choice and voice for our scholars. And so as they went through our school, every single day we tried to bring in spiritual elements around citizenship. And so every day we would have a morning meeting, right, which was the equivalent of coming together as a community. And we would have music, and we would have speeches, and we would have testimony, and I come from, I told you my dad's family is Quaker, and so you would have moments of silence to meditate and to think. We would have all of these things for our kids in our daily routines that built spirituality around scholarship and citizenship towards that purpose that we shared together. We came from massive amounts of different faiths as students and faculty. But together we had this common purpose that we defined and that set us forward on a path together in concert with one another towards a culture that we were co-creating. We were building a culture that hadn't existed before, one that we wanted to build from whole cloth. And so we did things like we had a weekly town hall where we cited an oath, right? The equivalent of like, you know, a Catholic prayer or any other religious sort of doctrine. We together would say, I pledge allegiance to my future at Democracy Prep Public Schools and to the values for which it stands, one team under dream with citizenship and scholarship for all. And we would say that week after week after week after week, such that you can now find a Democracy Prep senior or Democracy Prep junior in college and say, what's the Democracy Prep oath? And they would be able to tell you word for word because it is in them. It is part of who they are. It is part of their spirit. It is part of their purpose as they walk this earth. It is to have a dream and a team to work together. Now, we had to do a lot of work to get to this point. This was not easy. To get the Secretary General of the United Nations to be our keynote speaker at graduation took a lot of effort. We had a hook because I had taught in Korea, and he is Korean, and what he got to come and tell our students was that he, in 1950, went to school under a tree in war-torn South Korea. He's now the Secretary General of the United Nations. He's sitting at the Apollo Theater with some of the poorest kids in America who have now got Regents diploma, advanced Regents diplomas, with more APs per capita than most suburbs, whose absolute performance on their Regents exams beats Scarsdale and Westchester County, who are having results that are absolutely unfathomable to most of America, and they did it in the same way that Ban Ki-moon did. Respecting teachers, grit, growth mindset, hard work, and a purpose, and a culture, and a spirit that they work together to achieve. And so I'm going to start to wrap up and basically try to come to some things that I hope you can take away from this hypothesis and this data that I'm sharing with you today. And so I care about democracy. That, for me, is the word that spirit means. I think that this is what empowers people, that empowers our students, that empowers our families, that empowers our teachers. And so for me, if it's choice and voice, we really need a ubiquitous school choice. And by which I mean every kid needs to have an option to go to whatever school is right for them. There are now places in this country where that's true. The first one is New Orleans. It took a hurricane. That's not what we should use as a policy mechanism. Instead, what we should do is say in New Orleans, which is the city with the highest gains that any city has had over the past decade by leaps and bounds, the second being DC, which is close, they got ubiquitous school choice by basically saying, if you want to travel really far across town, you can. You're welcome to travel far across town. We're going to provide busing, and it's going to take a longer trip, and there's public transportation, but you can. And we're going to offer all the seats, even at the wealthy side of town school, by lottery, by random assignment. And so you can imagine that in the old system, right, the people in that immediate zone would say, no way, I don't want that. You're going to bring all those poor kids and those black kids into my part of town? And what basically New Orleans has been able to do is because the system was wiped out and there were no schools, they got to rebuild and rethink from scratch in a relinquishing model. And they have 3 principles to their ubiquitous school choice model. Educators run schools. Not the government. Educators run schools. Parents choose schools. And the government holds schools accountable for health and safety and long-term outcomes. And that very simple formula has given them some of the best results in the country. The second idea is zones of choice within the school day. And so this is actually the one thing Lisa probably want me to talk about for like a half an hour, but you got Korea. I don't know, sorry. So the idea of zones of school choice is something that we did at Democracy Prep because we basically recognized that our kids were massively diverse in terms of their faiths, in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their own things that they brought to school. And so we would have students from 47 different countries. Actually, a quick side note is I got really mad after a couple of months of Democracy Prep, and I'd have visitors come in all the time and say, this is amazing, this is so great, it's a shame you're not diverse. And I said, you mean I don't have white kids, right? Because they come from 47 different countries? I don't think you understand the definition of diversity. Diversity doesn't mean you have white kids. It means that you have different backgrounds, different faiths, different traditions, different spirituality. Whatever the thing is that is different, we have them all in our amazing schools 6 blocks from here. And you can go and walk in and see that diversity. You can't see it all in skin color. You can't see it all on economic level, right? We don't have socioeconomic diversity at the level I want. We don't have racial diversity in some ways. But we do have incredible diversity and a wealth of cultural backgrounds to draw from and to use as assets instead of thinking about as liabilities. And so we took those and we basically said we can give zones of school choice within the school day. And so if our kids need to pray for parts of the day, we're going to find ways to do that and design schedules around them. And we created these zones of choice within the school day, in addition to the zones of school choice to choose the school itself. And the third idea is curricular and course choice. And this is especially true at our high school level. But basically, we wanted to make sure that kids were not feeling like there was one right way to get to the answer of college and citizenship for all, or scholarship and citizenship for all. That there were lots of different paths, and college can mean different things, and there are colleges for special needs students, and there are colleges that serve kids with Down syndrome, and there are colleges all over the country, and that we just expanded the definition of college in some ways, but that we thought that there was a different course path by personalization for every single kid. We kept the bar high, but we personalized what they needed. And so as a special ed teacher, right, you have these things called accommodations and modifications, and we maximized accommodations, and we minimized modifications. That doesn't mean we had made no modifications. It just meant that every kid was trying to reach to the highest bar that was possible for them, and every time they reached it, we raised it again. So it wasn't like we set a bar and said, great job, you're over it. We reached the bar, and we said, great, we're going to go higher now. And so creating that curricular and course choice that always pushed them one step further is part of what got us to the next level. So I'm going to wrap up with a depressing but optimistic thought at the same time. This is all about to change, because technology is changing the culture every day faster than we are. So even though we have our kids at Democracy Prep for 8 hours a day, technology is changing it faster. So it's only not a question anymore about whether it's going to happen, it's how soon. So we have to change the unit of change in the classroom and the school, because this revolutionary tool that I was talking about, it can create culture and purpose, but it can also be used for ill. So we have to figure out how to welcome and embrace technology and make it a tool for good, for positive culture, for that hybrid culture that we're seeking, instead of a tool that is distracting and that reduces attention spans and that gets kids off track and to do bad things. And so we have to find a way to use this tool that is changing everything in our lives for good instead of bad. So I will leave you with this Langston Hughes thought. He wrote his poetry here in Harlem. Our schools we have about 10 schools in a 10-block radius down the hill. And he said, let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. And for me, our students to be spiritual, they need that choice. They need that purpose. They need that opportunity to have scholarship and citizenship. And it's our job as educators to give it to them. And so my new boss says, we are the ones we've been waiting for. So every single person in this room, I hope to give you a charge, to challenge me, to disagree with me, to argue with me, but also to go out and seek the change the world, be the change you seek in the world. To accomplish Gandhi's dream, President Obama's dream, Dr. King's dream, Langston Hughes' dream, to make this possible. And so I think that this is doable. I would not keep fighting as hard and working as hard as I do if I did not think this was possible, but I also recognize how hard each and every one of our jobs is as an educator. And we've got a lot more work to do, especially for the kids that need us the most. So I challenge you to continue to do that work, and I'm looking forward to taking some questions and some challenges and to continuing the conversation as we go forward. Thank you, everybody. So I think we have about 15 minutes, which was right in the lower end of that time frame that I gave. But would love to hear your thoughts, your disagreements, your questions, your practical questions about how we pull this off across now 20 schools and 5,000 kids. We got a question up there.
I like what you said. I'm going to be the pessimist cynic to start and say in the run up to a year from now, I have yet to hear the word education in anyone's conversation. Your thoughts on that?
And I assume you mean in the presidential world. So, I'm already getting in a lot of trouble by calling for revolution, so I don't want to do too much political prognostication. But I will say this, the federal government spends 8% of our public K-12 education dollars. There's actually a federal statute across the country that basically says we're not allowed to make education policy at the federal level. Let's see if I can find that quickly. So, big thing to know about that is that this is not a federal issue. So I want the president, I love this president, I work for him, I'm proud of him, but this is not a presidential challenge. This is an educator challenge. This is a culture challenge, right? Culture is not created by the president. Sometimes we set vision and we call to go to the moon, and there are great important roles for the president, but at the end of the day, this is up to us in schools and classrooms. And so for 5,000 kids at Democracy Prep, it didn't matter who the president was. We did most of our work during George W. Bush. So it didn't matter who the president was, it mattered that we were setting the culture in our classrooms, in our schools, and for them, we've changed everything. And so it's up to us to change everything for our kids, whoever the president may be.
I would love to hear you elucidate a bit more about the zones of change within the school day, within the public schools, Seth.
Is she a plant? So basically what we tried to identify were things like floating holidays. I got to Democracy Prep and built Democracy Prep in 2005 and was looking at our calendar, right, to build the calendar out. And I was trying to figure out how we were going to add more school time. South Koreans go to school 20 more days. They go to school more hours of school a day. Let's figure out how do we add more time. And so I looked at the calendar and I found all these days I was sort of like, wait, the entire New York City system gets off for Yom Kippur? I have no Jewish kids. Why are we all going off for Yom Kippur? And so we basically said, this makes no sense. We're going to give every kid 2 days of religious holiday, and they can choose what days they want. They let their teacher know. It's usually in advance because religious holidays are scheduled. And so they take the days that they want to take. And then we all go to school on Yom Kippur. And if I have a teacher in the same exact bucket who says, I am taking off the holiday, then we know that, and that teacher gets off. So it's the same model. So one is zones of choice for teachers in terms of the time that they need to worship and to honor their own spirituality. And then it's also just during the day, is that we built into our school day an hour every single day, which is on paper, usually it's a tutoring block, but it's a zone of choice. And that zone of choice for some kids is remediation. For some kids, it is accelerated learning and enrichment. And for kids who needed time to make sure they were going to go pray, if you take them out of their math class every day for 10 minutes, right, they're not going to learn as much math as the kids in class. And so that doesn't really work. So we had to figure out how to get their tutoring schedule around the Muslim holiday or the Muslim prayer, and that was something that we tried to work with their zone of choice in our schedule in a pretty practical, tangible, tactical way to give every kid those kinds of opportunities where they needed them. Thank you. Other questions? How about one over here?
Hi. So I'm curious to know more about what you think about the Common Core and how in some ways it might be working to do this for public school students who don't have access to charter schools.
Yep. So first, a semantic point. I wouldn't be remiss if I did not remind you that charter schools are public schools. We are public schools, publicly accountable, publicly funded, publicly accessible, and open to all students. In fact, we are far more public than most New York City public schools. Because if you want to go to Bronx Science, you can't unless you pass the test. If you want to go to Democracy Prep, you can as long as you live here. You don't have to be a citizen, you don't have to pass a test, you don't have to do anything. So we are actually, public charter schools are more public than most middle and high schools, certainly in New York City. Second thing is sort of Common Core. I am a huge proponent personally of Common Core because I've spent a lot of time in the weeds with it. And I know that the expectations and the rigor bar has gone up. And so when I go back to my both data from Roland Fryer and personal experience in Korea around rigor, Common Core is deeper learning. Common Core is more coherent learning. Common Core is, on the whole, a much more sort of logical progression for learning content than New York State standards were, and certainly than 50 different standards were. And so what's exciting about Common Core, whatever gets branded at the end. So the branding is irrelevant. More than 40 states have adopted some form of what we say publicly as college and career ready standards. And more than 40 states have adopted this. So the name is going to change, and some governor is going to say, I'm pulling out a Common Core, but you know what's going to happen to their standards? They're going to change 3%. Right? And they're going to add Louisiana history, but everything else will stay the same in the Common Core that was, even though they'll rebrand it as something else. That may even happen in New York. As long as the bar goes up, I'm happy, and that's really what I think Common Core has done. And we actually just saw that. The NAEP scores went down for the first time in a couple of grades in the last week. And part of the logic behind that is that the Common Core sequence was actually more rigorous, and the transition to Common Core was hard. And the NAEP's questions don't change over time, so longitudinally they stay the same. But the PARCC and the Smarter Balanced assessments are dramatically better than the old New York State Pearson assessments were. I mean, like night and day better. They're more open-ended, they're more deep thought, they're more challenging than the old assessments were. So this is not perfect. Like I don't think that Common Core is perfect or Smarter Balanced or PARCC are perfect. I just think that it is such a step function from where we were just 5 years ago in terms of the expectations we had. And most importantly to me is that we're now going to see those experiments. So remember I talked about random control trials and drawing a line north and south. Well, in America, up until recently, you couldn't compare kids across states because they all use different standards and different assessments and different tests. So how could I tell you whether we were doing a better job in Massachusetts, New York? There was a NAEP, which is a statistical sample, not every kid, and it was only every couple of years, and it was only in a couple grades. It was grade band. So we couldn't even really tell you what was working on a short-term basis. Now they're going to have common core standards, common standards with common assessments. I can now tell you what's working in Tennessee, Washington, D.C., and New Orleans have been the most deeply that have embraced both statewide and citywide the Common Core, I think the strongest, and I've seen some of the strongest results on all the external assessments as well. So I like it. How about somebody over here? Cameo.
So Seth and I went to college together, and so it's just really interesting. My kind of pathway into spirituality and education has been through the lens of the African American tradition, which I believe is absolutely rooted in spirituality, right? So you think about slavery, and in law, African Americans were considered 3/5 of a person, right? So the entire time we are working towards reclaiming and owning and honoring our spirit, right? And so our educational, everything in our education is about that point, right? So even during segregation, you think of segregated times, African Americans were thriving, right? So you mentioned like the grit, growth mindset, great teachers, all of that. I'm from Los Angeles, California, grew up in Black Los Angeles, went to an elementary school with, the teachers were diverse, but the majority of students were African American. I ended up at Brown University, low income student. And I guess one of my tensions within education, the education space, and even within conversations around spirituality, is that a lot of times the cultural legacy of the students that we're serving is not honored. It is not recognized that students of African descent, the legacy has been a very spiritual one. And so when you think about desegregation and what happened because of desegregation, busing, and so for middle school and high school, I was bused out into other schools, and you start to look at like the statistics on discipline, right? And the kids who are the school to prison pipeline, and how students who are suspended in schools end up in prison. That phenomenon happened when we were integrated. And so part of the challenge, I think, that I'm trying to bring to the fore is that there is an issue here of racism and the historical legacy of that I am pushing to really, really face what the spiritual aspect of that it's social justice. It's spiritual activism. It's all of these things, but really, really recognizing, especially in the public school space where we're dealing with so many kids of indigenous descent, that this is a cultural legacy, right? And because of oppression, we haven't been able to practice many of the spiritual traditions, but it is part of our heritage and our legacy. And so I'm wondering, I'm hopeful that educators of color, educators of indigenous descent are brought to the table to have conversations about school design and being more vocal about our belief that spirituality needs to be it is at the center of our legacy. Yeah.
So, years later, I still love the passion and share it deeply. So I think, your finger is right on it, right? So when I start this presentation by talking about this incredible injustice, the reality of where America is today, it is based on all of that historical injustice that is compounded and basically been a snowball getting worse and worse and worse in all these other areas. And so what I see the school unit as is the compulsory tool we have to actually start to undo those things. And it is very hard to do that, right? So we think about the master's tools and what are we going to do with the master's tools and how do we figure out how to undo and break down some of those historical trends. My own personal experience with this is very complex, and as I think all of us bring to our own personal stories. So I told you I went to New York City public schools. Well, junior high 54, which is like 12 blocks from here, had 1,000 kids when I got there, and there were 9 white kids. And so I went to basically an all-black, relatively low-performing, black and Latino, but primarily black, low-performing school. And had this very different experience growing up than other kids from my parents' education background might have. And so I was able to understand in a way that not everybody who went to a different background some of those traditions, and still can only understand a tiny, shallow component of that. So what we have to do in schools is recognize our own ignorance, recognize that I come to a classroom, to a school, to this conversation with a tremendous amount of privilege, and then we have to bring in our families and our students and others and let their voices be spoken. So I spoke mostly today about choice, right? But the other part is voice. And so I think what you're capturing, I think beautifully, is this idea of voice, is how do we give voice to the people that have been voiceless, whether structurally or just culturally, historically, and give them voice, because without both of those things, without both choice and voice, I don't think we have democracy. I don't think we have the kind of schools or country that we want to live in. And so we have a lot of work to do to provide that. I can give you a bunch of examples of the like concrete things we do at Democracy Prep around student voice. And a lot of it just has to do with giving kids space, again, zones of choice where they are picking what they care about and working on. And so that, whether we call this project-based learning or whatever the language is that we're going to use in euphemism, it's a way to say to them, we're going to bring you to the assembly. We're going to let you testify on this. Write your speech and actually use your voice and pick what the things that you care most about are, pick a different side of the issue. And so we've had the youngest kids ever to testify in front of the city council, the state assembly, the state senate, the United States Congress, not the youngest ever, but some of the youngest ever at the United States Congress, because we basically gave them an opportunity to share their voice and share those personal stories that are building a narrative that is true to them. And now that they are off in college, they are also having the opportunity that many of us had to explore their own history even more. It's hard for a 10-year-old to do that. It is much easier once we get them to college with the foundational skills that they need. So remember that 8th grade stat I gave you about if we equalize their academic performance by 8th grade, then we start to see the reduction in the racial disparities. So part of the job of our K-8 program is to get those academic credentials equal, or actually in our case better than middle class and white kids, and then give them the capacity so that they can now soar after that. So we can keep talking for a long time about it, but thank you for your thoughts. One over here. Oh.
I'm a college professor in India. I'm teaching in teacher education college. So your lecture was very comprehensive, very informative. I have just one query. In India, although India is considered to be a poor country, but we do have subsidy in higher education. In India, generally, students are not deprived of higher education due to lack of money. As I am listening in your lecture, that poverty and money is a big hurdle in USA in getting higher education. So when India is considered not to be a so rich country, rather a poor country, although India has lot of versatility, so poor, rich, all type of people you can find there, different culture, very vast country. So when Indian government can give subsidy in higher education, in our student, I can tell you, even the fees, you cannot imagine the fees which you pay for the full year in nursery primary classes. in that much amount you can pay fees for 1 year in higher education, in government colleges. So why can't US government give subsidy in higher education?
So,
This was my question.
great question. I've just come back from a bunch of time in India looking at some of their K-12 challenges that prevent kids from even getting access to that higher education system because so many kids, millions of kids are out of school. I have just a total curiosity and like privilege of the mic. How many people in this room, with a quick show of hands, don't be bashful, support vouchers for K-12 education? All right, so I'm going to say like 20% or so. How many people in this room support Pell Grants? Is that like emphatic yes? So normally when I ask that question, like somewhere around 10, 20% of people say, oh, I support vouchers, and most people are like, vouchers, bad. And then I say how many people support Pell Grants, everybody's like, Pell Grants are great. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. It's saying we're going to spend government dollars to send you to a school of your choice, and we're going to hope that that gets you on the path that we want you to get you to. So we actually spend more money right now. If we reallocated the way we spend our public higher education dollars today, there's a great story in The Atlantic about this. If we totally reallocated, if we sort of stripped it all back and rethought it, we could send every single kid in America to a public institution for free tomorrow. Right, with no tuition whatsoever. So it's not even about the dollars we're spending. I think it's $63 billion a year in subsidies that we're putting in at the federal level. So we could do that if we chose to, but our policy mechanisms are not designed to do that, mostly at the state level, a little bit at the federal level. So I think you're right that that's an issue. However, and here's the thing that, again, at the beginning, a lot of people were talking about financial aid and poverty as challenges to going to higher ed. We are in a bubble. Because when we hear things like college tuition is $50,000 a year, how will I pay, right? The reality for our kids, for low-income kids in America, is that's not true at all. Our kids fall into 3 buckets at democracy prep. Every single one of them gets about, on average, between 5 and 10 college acceptances. They fall into 3 buckets. Our top third of kids go to college wherever they want for free. Free ride to any college, period, full stop. So that's just not a question. If they go to the Ivy League, as many of our kids now have done, they go for free. If they go to the Naval Academy, they go for free. They go for free because their grades and their SATs are so good that everybody wants them. We have our middle group of kids who are going to private institutions. They're taking out debt, mostly public debt, which is subsidized, and it's not bad. They get their Pell Grant, and they're okay, right? They come out of undergrad with about $20,000 of debt on average. And then our bottom group of kids who are going generally to public schools who take out very little debt and actually are able, between existing debt and Pell Grants and SUNY and CUNY, to come out with more like $10,000 total for a 4-year degree. That's attainable. Right? That is the investment that is worth making for our low-income kids. So we should not think that the problem is really about college financing, although that's a problem. It's more a problem for middle class and upper middle class people than it is for poor kids. And so we actually just need to get our kids able to get into the schools and to succeed there. That's a much harder challenge. So I hope that answered a little bit of the question. I don't know how we're doing on time. You want to take 2 more? You want to take 1 more? What do you want? I lost my timekeeper. Like we've 2 questions. All right. Yes.
My question is around your expectations. And I think that I work at a school that has similar high expectations of their students. But part of that goes with it is a tremendous amount of stress in my middle school kids. And so I wanted to ask, when you raised your 70% expectation to 83, how did your students respond?
With frustration and grumpiness and a little bit of anger and a little bit of like, what the heck. But the answer of stress is a very good one, especially because I just used the Korean model as an example. They have toxic stress because they went too far on the other side, right? So there became a pathology where kids were saying, I have to sleep 4 hours a night or I can't succeed. And that's actually too far, which is why I come back to kimchi tacos and saying that the balance is somewhere more of both of those things. But I will say this. If I have a choice between the kinds of stress that our kids have, give me too much homework every day of the week. Give me my teachers expect too much of me every day of the week. Give me my teachers want me to go to a college and I don't think I can go every day of the week. Like, that is great stress for where our kids are coming from. And that is simply because their parents, for the most part, 90%, did not go to college themselves. And so they're not putting that pressure on them. They're not putting that stress on them. They're not pushing it, not because they don't want it. They actually do, but they didn't experience it. It wasn't their authentic voice in many cases. So our parents desperately want their kids to go to college, but they can't say, when I went to college, this is what happened, and when I filled out the FAFSA bubble. So like, we have to present that stress to the kids, and we have to say, the FAFSA deadline is now, and you have to get, that's stressful. but it's also necessary to make sure that they can end the multi-generational poverty that most of our families have been in. So I agree with the broader point that higher expectations lead to stress. I am concerned about it once it goes too far, but I think that for low-income kids in America, like where that too far line is, like we're still nowhere near that line. Even at schools like Democracy Prep, we're closer, but I think there's still higher bar that we could raise, and that's my 83 example. Like I think we still can do more to raise the bar for our kids. All right, last question for this part of our conversation. Sure, yes, of course, because you said so. Although I don't know why you moved from there to there, so I'm still confused about that.
I wonder if you could just tell me a little more about how you hire teachers at Democracy Prep, your thoughts about credentialing, and all the associated issues that go with that.
So it's a big question. I will do my best to sort of summarize it. The first is competency, not credentials. Right? So every teacher that is hired goes through a process that includes resume screen, phone interview, in-person interview, and most importantly, sample lesson. About 50% of the teachers historically did 2 sample lessons because we came back after the first one and said, no, wasn't that good, here's some feedback. One of the other things we're looking for in that feedback cycle when teachers are good but not yet where we want them to be is we give them really tough, critical, almost mean feedback to see how they respond, to make sure that when they come back they don't sort of like blow it off but are seriously embracing that, because our feedback culture at the professional development level is tremendous. Our principals, assistant principals, master teachers, coaches are in classrooms every single day. You will not go a day at Democracy Prep without a administrator or coach in your room, ever, in any classroom at every grade level. So the expectations of feedback loop are really important, so we screen for that on the front end. We are looking for people that have a couple of specific characteristics. One is, and I used this term earlier, intellectual malleability, right? We need them to believe that culture is malleable. We need to believe that they can say this. If they believe in a fixed mindset as opposed to a growth mindset, they're not going to work. So they need to have intellectual malleability. They have to have a quantitative mindset. So I said at the very beginning, I care about data, and so our art teachers have a very data-rich curriculum. Like our theater program is one of the most data-rich theater programs you'll ever see. And so what we've done is basically said to those brilliant teachers, come up with the data that you want us to measure. It's not a standardized test for producing rent. Right? It is, how do you want to measure this? Is it audience members? Is it number of students practicing? Is it number of hours on stage? Is it number of minutes sung? Like, what is the thing you want to do that gives us the data that shows that you're actually accomplishing that goal? And then we hold them accountable for that data over the course of the year. So data mindset, culture, malleability, cultural competence. So we're making sure that our teachers understand that the students that they serve are very often different than themselves and have to be able to navigate a tricky world in that case. We're a lot of work to do on that. About 60% of our staff are folks of color, but we serve 99% kids of color, so that's we still have ways to go in that area. And then we want to make sure they're smart. We say hungry, humble, and smart. So they have to be working really hard, they have to be able to take feedback, and they have to be able to do the content. So those pieces come together, and then the real question once we get them through the door is how do we coach them and support them once they're in the door? The last thing I'll say on that, don't expect a lifetime of teaching. And so that is a very conscious decision we make up front. It is crazy to think that any profession in the modern day and age is going to keep somebody doing the same job every day for 30 years. Like, it just doesn't happen in any other place, except we think sometimes still it's a goal in education. It's not. So we're perfectly happy if a teacher teaches with us for 3 or 4 years, if they're awesome for those 3 or 4 years. If they're not good, we let them go. So we also have flexibility over hiring and firing, which means that we can make decisions pretty easily. Our best teachers stay with us, in part because of our salary structure, which gives them, our base salary is 65, and our sort of leading teachers right now are around 120, and that's all in public dollars, remember. So that's not fancy math. It's just saying, if we have in New York $15,000 per student, what do we budget per classroom? What do we pay the teacher? How do we get the teacher as many quality benefits so that they stay with us as possible? So the math of this is very doable. It's actually very simple when you start at the bottom up, as opposed to when you start to think like New York City spends $30 billion a year on K-12 education. That's not actually very helpful. It's very helpful to say, how much money do I have for this classroom to get them from here to the end of the year? And what's the most important ingredient in that success? The teacher. So we put as much possible money into that teacher, and how do we support them with coaching and development around them with the rest of the money? PD, coaching, hiring talent is the ingredient that is the most hard. It's also the most scarce. So we have 20 schools now, 5,000 kids, K-12, Harlem, the South Bronx, Camden, Anacostia, and DC, and we just opened a new school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And the barrier to growth, why do we not have 100 schools, is just talent. So we have not figured out how to crack the nut of exponential talent growth. We've only figured out how to get linear talent growth, and that's not enough for the problem that we have in front of us. With that, I thank you very much.
Seth, thank you. That was fantastic. Okay. Changing culture. Changing culture. We'll take a 5-minute stretch and we'll move to our first afternoon symposium.